Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. I've crawled out of my influenza bed to record this episode, so if I seem to have some more gravitas in my voice, that's where it's from. This is your monster for the month. It's a ghost story set in France with something that is referred to as a succubus, but statistics will follow eventually on the website. I've cut out the majority of the story so that you only get the occurrence of the monster. The setup is that a young tourist goes to Paris, sees a friend of his from school. The friend has inherited a property but can't keep people in it because it is said to be haunted. They get two other friends and agree to go on an expedition. As they walk through the house, they find out that it has an infernal aura. For example, it has a space which has a brass pentagram in the floor and a strange naked red woman statue that completely fills the upper level of the roof. It has another area which has clearly got an altar. They decide to each take a room, looking out into a corridor, so that should any of them call out, the others will immediately rush to their rescue. And because this is a early Victorian, story, they all believe that smoking pipes is extremely important in terms of staying awake. That brings you up to speed for the first 25 minutes or so. Thanks to the LibriVox recorder and production team. Now let's rejoin them for the last third of the story.
Black Spirits and White, a Book of Ghost Stories by Ralph Adams Cram. Number 252, Rue Monsieur le Prince. Recording by Andrew Gotts. It was arranged that we should each occupy a room, leaving the doors open with the lights burning, and at the slightest cry or knock we were all to rush at once to the room from which the warning sound might come. There was no communication between the rooms, to be sure, but as the doors all opened into the corridor, every sound was plainly audible. The last room fell to me, and I looked it over carefully. It seemed innocent enough, a commonplace, square, rather lofty Parisian sleeping room, finished in wood painted white with a small marble mantel, a dusty floor of inlaid maple and cherry, walls hung with an ordinary French paper, apparently quite new, and two deeply embrasured windows looking out on the court. I opened the swinging sash with some trouble, and sat down in the window seat with my lantern beside me trained on the only door, which gave on the corridor. The wind had gone down, and it was very still without, still and hot. The masses of luminous vapor were gathering thickly overhead, no longer urged by the gusty wind. The great masses of rank wisteria leaves, with here and there a second blossoming of purple flowers, hung dead over the window in the sluggish air. Across the roofs I could hear the sound of a belated fiacre in the streets below. I filled my pipe again and waited. For a time the voices of the men in the other rooms were a companionship, and at first I shouted to them now and then, but my voice echoed rather unpleasantly through the long corridors, and had a suggestive way of reverberating around the left wing beside me, and coming out at a broken window at its extremity like the voice of another man. I soon gave up my attempts at conversation, and devoted myself to the task of keeping awake. It was not easy. Why did I eat that lettuce salad at Père Garceau's? I should have known better. It was making me irresistibly sleepy, and wakefulness was absolutely necessary. It was certainly gratifying to know that I could sleep, that my courage was by me to that extent, but in the interests of science I must keep awake. But almost never, it seemed, had sleep looked so desirable. 100 times nearly I would doze for an instant, only to awake with a start and find my pipe gone out. Nor did the exertion of relighting it pull me together. I struck my match mechanically, and with the first puff dropped off again. It was most vexing. I got up and walked around the room. It was most annoying. My cramped position had almost put both my legs to sleep. I could hardly stand. I felt numb as though with cold. There was no longer any sound from the other rooms, nor from without. I sank down in my window seat. How dark it was growing. I turned up the lantern. That pipe again, how obstinately it kept going out, and my last match was gone. The lantern, too, was that going out? I lifted my hand to turn it up again. It felt like lead, and fell beside me. Then I awoke, absolutely. I remembered the story of the haunters and the haunted. This was the horror. I tried to rise, to cry out. My body was like lead, my tongue was paralyzed. I could hardly move my eyes, and the light was going out. There was no question about that. Darker and darker yet, little by little, the pattern of the paper was swallowed up in the advancing night. A prickling numbness gathered in every nerve. My right arm slipped without feeling from my lap to my side, and I could not raise it. It swung helpless. A thin, keen humming began in my head like the cicadas on a hillside in September. The darkness was coming fast. Yes, this was it. Something was subjecting me, body and mind, to slow paralysis. Physically, I was already dead. If I could only hold my mind, my consciousness, I might still be safe, but could I? Could I resist the mad horror of this silence, the deepening dark, the creeping numbness? I knew that, like the man in the ghost story, my only safety lay here. It had come at last. My body was dead. I could no longer move my eyes. They were fixed in that last look on the place where the door had been, now only a deepening of the dark. Utter night. The last flicker of the lantern was gone. I sat and waited. My mind was still keen, but how long would it last? There was a limit even to the endurance of the utter panic of fear. Then the end began. In the velvet blackness came two white eyes, milky, opalescent, small, far away. Awful eyes, like a dead dream. More beautiful than I can describe, the flakes of white flame moving from the perimeter inward, disappearing in the center, like a never-ending flow of opal water into a circular tunnel. I could not have moved my eyes had I possessed the power. They devoured the fearful, beautiful things that grew slowly, slowly larger, fixed on me, advancing, growing more beautiful, the white flakes of light sweeping more swiftly into the blazing vortices, the awful fascination deepening in its insane intensity as the white, vibrating eyes grew nearer, larger. Like a hideous and implacable engine of death, the eyes of the unknown horror swelled and expanded until they were close before me. Enormous, terrible, and I felt a slow, cold, wet breath propelled with mechanical regularity against my face, enveloping me in its fetid mist, in its charnel house deadliness. With ordinary fear goes always a physical terror, but with me in the presence of this unspeakable thing was only the utter and awful terror of the mind, the mad fear of a prolonged and ghostly nightmare. Again and again I tried to shriek, to make some noise, but physically I was utterly dead. I could only feel myself go mad with the terror of hideous death. The eyes were close on me, their movements so swift that they seemed to be but palpitating flames. The dead breath was around me like the depths of the deepest sea. Suddenly a wet, icy mouth like that of a dead cuttlefish, shapeless, jelly-like, fell over mine. The horror began slowly to draw my life from me, but as enormous and shuddering folds of palpitating jelly swept sinuously around me, my will came back. My body awoke with the reaction of final fear, and I closed with the nameless death that enfolded me. What was it that I was fighting? My arms sunk through the unresisting mass that was turning me to ice. Moment by moment, new folds of cold jelly swept around me, crushing me with the force of titans. I fought to wrest my mouth from this awful thing that sealed it, but if ever I succeeded and caught a single breath, the wet, sucking mass closed over my face again before I could cry out. I think I fought for hours, desperately, insanely, in a silence that was more hideous than any sound. Fought until I felt final death at hand, until the memory of all my life rushed over me like a flood, until I no longer had strength to wrench my face from that hellish succubus, until with a last mechanical struggle I fell and yielded to death. Then I heard a voice say, "If he is dead, I can never forgive myself. I was to blame." Another replied, "He is not dead. I know we can save him if only we reach the hospital in time. Drive like hell, coacher. 20 francs for you if you get there in 3 minutes." Then there was night again and nothingness, until I suddenly awoke and started around. I lay in a hospital ward, very white and sunny. Some yellow fleur-de-lis stood beside the head of the pallet, and a tall sister of mercy sat by my side. To tell the story in a few words, I was in the Hôtel Dieu, where the men had taken me that fearful night of the 12th of June. I asked for Fargeau or Duchesne, and by the latter came, and sitting beside the bed told me all that I did not know. It seems that they had sat, each in his room, hour after hour, hearing nothing, very much bored and disappointed. Soon after 2 o'clock, Fargeau, who was in the next room, called to me to ask if I was awake. I gave no reply, and, after shouting once or twice, he took his lantern and came to investigate. The door was locked on the inside. He instantly called Dardèche and Duchesne, and together they hurled themselves against the door. It resisted. Within they could hear irregular footsteps dashing here and there with heavy breathing. Although frozen with terror, they fought to destroy the door and finally succeeded, using a great slab of marble that formed the shelf of the mantel in Fargeau's room. As the door crashed in, they were suddenly hurled back against the walls of the corridor, as though by an explosion. The lanterns were extinguished, and they found themselves in utter silence and darkness. As soon as they recovered from the shock, they leaped into the room and fell over my body in the middle of the floor. They lighted one of the lanterns and saw the strangest sight that can be imagined. The floor and walls, to the height of about 6 feet, were running with something that seemed like stagnant water, thick, glutinous, sickening. As for me, I was drenched with the same cursed liquid. The odor of musk was nauseating. They dragged me away, stripped off my clothing, wrapped me in their coats, and hurried to the hospital, thinking me perhaps dead. Soon after sunrise, Dardèche left the hospital, being assured that I was in a fair way to recovery with time, and with Fargeau went up to examine by daylight the traces of the adventure that was so nearly fatal. They were too late. Fire engines were coming down the street as they passed the academy. A neighbor rushed up to Dardèche. "Oh, monsieur, what misfortune! Yet what fortune! It is true, la bouche d'enfer. I beg pardon, the residence of the lamented Mademoiselle de Tartas was burned, but not wholly, only the ancient building. The wings were saved, and for that great credit is due the brave firemen. Monsieur will remember them, no doubt." It was quite true. Whether a forgotten lantern overturned in the excitement had done the work, or whether the origin of the fire was more supernatural, it was certain that the mouth of hell was no more. A last engine was pumping slowly as Dardèche came up. 6 limp and 1 distended hose stretched through the porte cochère, and within only the façade of Francis I remained, draped still with the black stems of the wisteria. Beyond lay a great vacancy, where thin smoke was rising slowly. Every floor was gone, and the strange halls of Mademoiselle Bly de Tartas were only a memory. With Dardèche I visited the place last year, but in the stead of the ancient walls was then only a new and ordinary building, fresh and respectable. Yet the wonderful stories of the old bouche d'enfer still lingered in the quarter, and will hold there, I do not doubt, until the day of judgment.
Your saga may vary.